A few months ago, I bought a 30 lot mobile home park for $725,000. And within weeks of buying it, put $85,000 into completely repaving the park because it just looked terrible. Now, mobile home parks are income producing property, so they're valued at what their income they produce is. Now, in this case, a road doesn't generate more income, so it doesn't directly increase the value. But in this video, I want to break down why we spent the money on this and how much value we think it indirectly adds to the value of this park. Now, if you're new to the channel, my name is Jeff Flynn, and for the last 3 to 4 years, I've been investing strictly in mobile home parks, and now at this point, I'm a full-time investor. And on this channel, I like to break down the projects that I'm working on, what they cost, the value I think they add, and some of the real-world life lessons along the way. So if that's something that you're interested in learn more about, do me a huge favor and click the subscribe button so you don't miss any of the videos that I put out. Now, the backstory on this park is very similar to other parks I've bought, where the owner built it 30, 40 years ago, and at the time they paved it, things were real cheap, and it filled up over time, but they didn't do anything for the last 30 years to maintain it. So at this point, it was beyond the point of, hey, patching things here or there. It needed a complete renovation, and the owners didn't budget for that. Now, they were free and clear, so they could have gone out and got a loan to do it, but that's not what these owners do. They typically get to a point where they say, hey, I'm just not going to fix anything and I'll just sell this thing. So that's where I come in, right? So we bought this park and the roads were god awful. Now, I've never been to the Middle East, but I'm pretty sure the roads there are probably a little bit nicer than what we had here. We had potholes the size of the entire roaded sections. And when you looked at the potholes, the tenants were actually just taking bricks. I mean, some of them are, carpenters and things like that. So they get some bricks from extra projects they're working on building house, and they were just trying to put bricks in the road so that they wouldn't scrape the bottoms of their cars they drove through. Just a terrible, terrible situation. So that's what we were inheriting when we bought this park. And by me, I mean me and my investors. And we had to do something to fix it. We knew right away, there's more than just the roads that need to be done in the case of this park. We need to get the tenants to fix some of their houses. We got to fix the mailboxes, the landscaping, just a general appeal of this park. And we're not going to be able to get the tenants to start fixing their own things if the roads looked as bad as they did. Because, imagine that conversation going and getting somebody on a fixed income to spend $100 on paint to paint their house. And me as the owner, I have the worst roads that you've ever seen. It's the most hypocritical thing that I could do. So really, in this case, the main focus on this point is let's get this park bought. Let's get the roads looking as nice as we can. So we immediately showed the tenants we are new owners. We have a new plan. The things that went by in the past, we're not going to tolerate. We're going to make sure that this park looks as nice as it can possibly look. Now, $85,000 in this case is not a small amount of money. It's generally not a small amount of money, especially not on a 30-lot park. Now, in this case, I ended up closing and only had to put $107,000 down to buy it, which I'll kind of break down more later in the video. But $85,000 is nearly what we invested to buy the property. So the first thing I wanted to make sure is, hey, at what point do I get my money back in terms of value? What's my break even? I spend $85,000. What do I have to get out of this property to get that back? Now, here's how I looked at that. In this case, it's an income producing property. So I basically wanted to figure out what kind of rent raise do I need to do per lot per month to be able to justify an increase in value of $85,000. Now, the way that would work is, okay, we have our $85,000 roads, and we have 30 lots, and a property like this, I think once it's stabilized, will be worth maybe an 8% cap rate. And so we need to add essentially $6,800 of annual NOI, net operating income, to be able to increase the value of the entire property by $85,000. Now, we typically have a 30% expense ratio once these properties are stabilized, which means that basically if we divide this number by 0.7, this is how much extra rent we need to collect a year to pay the extra expenses and still end up with an NOI of about $6,800. Now, that meant that we only have to charge an extra $27 per month per lot to increase the value of the park by $85,000. So definitely an easy ask. Okay, now here's an honest complication to this. This park was charging $200 a month when I bought it, and a park down the street outside of town about a mile and a half in very similar condition was charging $550. So could I justify a $27 rent raise without fixing the roads? Yes, I totally could have. So does that mean that the simple break-even analysis I did is just as simple as that? No, not really, right? We have to isolate what this value is going to be. And the way I did that was looking at the finished stabilized value. So let's fast forward. Let's say we've owned this property now for 5 years and we still haven't fixed the roads. Now, I look this as, okay, if the roads were paved, I bet we could justify an extra $50 a month per tenant. And if we didn't fix the roads, we probably wouldn't be able to. So let's look at the final value and say, okay, let's say that we charge $50 per month per tenant. What kind of value does that add? Now, to be honest with you, the $50 a month thing is really just a gut instinct and what I think you could justify, because at the end of the day, there's not enough data out there to isolate what a non-paved versus a paved park can get, especially in a particular market, right? So what I do is basically, to justify this, look at a video here and tell me if you would spend an extra $50 a month to live in a park that was completely repaved. Most people, probably 99.99% of people are going to say, yeah, I would spend that, especially when they're spending $60,000, $70,000 on their biggest investment in their life. They don't want to move it into a place that looks like this, like, somewhere in Fallujah, right? They want to move it into somewhere nice. So that's where that $50 a month figure comes from. So now what we're going to do is we're going to isolate the value of that $50 per month extra premium we can get if the whole place is pristine and paved versus not. Now, this is not immediate value. This is more of like, hey, once we fixed all the other things at the park, this is the extra value the roads are going to add to it then. Now, when we look at that, we're going to continue on with the same sort of math we did earlier to work backwards and figure out what rent raise we needed to do. Now, let's say at the end of the day, we can get an extra $50 a month. Now, at 30 lots, that means we'll collect an extra $18,000 per year in extra rent. If we continue to have a 30% expense ratio on that extra income, we'll have an extra $12,600 in NOI. So it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you remember that these properties are valued at basically a multiple, which is the cap rate in this case, at an 8% cap rate, we've added about $157,000 in value by having the roads paved and being able to get an extra $50 per month per lot. Now, in addition to just more NOI, there is actually a lot of value we add just in the fact that the NOI is of a higher quality. Now, what I mean by that, people don't pay the same cap rate for a crappy property versus a premium and nice and stabilized property, right? The whole reason is that the more stabilized something is, the less risky it seems as an investment. Perfect example, if you're going to loan money to your cousin and he just got out of prison, you're probably going to want 12, 15% return on your money, right? But if you're getting treasury bonds backed by the US government, which can literally print money, you'll take 3 or 4%, right? The riskier an investment is, the higher returns you need. So in this case, if we have a property that has just god-awful roads and it looks like crap, and it's going to need a lot of work to come in there and fix it, that is a risky investment, or riskier than if the property was totally pristine, everything is the way it needs to be, all the homes look nice, which in this case they're not yet, right? We got to still work on that. We got about 5 years to do that. But when the property is stabilized and clean, people will pay a higher price for it because they are willing to get less of a return because it is a less risky investment, or at least perceived to be a less risky investment. So let's look at the value that these roads might add in that case. Now, let's look at the same NOI. So let's say we're, half a decade down the road and this property is completely stabilized and our NOI is around $120,000 a year. If we haven't fixed the roads and things still look like crap, it might seem like a riskier investment to a future buyer or an appraiser. So they're going to value it, let's say, at an 8% cap rate. Now, let's say it is stabilized. There's still stabilized, but the roads are completely redone. The thing looks pristine. Someone has to buy it and they don't really have to do anything. People will pay a premium for that. And they will pay a higher price because it is less work, right? They're basically just buying a completely passive investment at that point. Now, in that case, let's say we can get 1% lower of a cap rate. That means that somebody would be willing to pay $1.7 million, whereas at an 8% cap rate, the math works out to about a $1.5 million. So by making it a more stabilized asset and a higher quality asset, we can add about $214,000, assuming it makes the exact same NOI, just by making it of a higher quality and potentially a lower cap rate. Now, I will be the first to admit to you, this is not an exact science, right? You cannot say within reason that this is for sure going to be the case, right? Interest rates might go up 2%, which would affect this, or they might go down, right? There are a lot of variables in this case that affect these things, but what we're trying to do in this case is say, hey, is it worth doing the roads? I'd say yes, right? First off, we just have to, right? They look so terrible. We were not going to buy this property if we're not planning to fix the roads, right? That's just my kind of personal feeling on this. But when we look at it, there are a lot of ways that we can justify the value of this property going up because we did it. And so it makes more sense to do it earlier in the process and definitely do as good a job as we possibly can. Now let's talk about how I actually financed the $85,000, because although I ended up writing a check to the guy for the full amount, I was able to bring that money in through 3 different areas. One was just extra money that was raised when we purchased the deal to make sure that there was enough cash. But I also got the bank to loan us a little bit more money, and I got the seller to credit us a little bit of money, so that the entire $85,000 was not just extra money I had to bring into the deal after putting a normal down payment. Now, because I have a really good relationship with the bank that I did this loan with, I was able to kind of show them my pro forma for the deal, and I was able to get an extra 5% loan to value than I normally can on a given deal. Typically what they'll do is if I give them a property that doesn't need nearly as much capex as this one, I would get about 75% loan to value. So if the deal's worth $1 million, they would loan me $750,000. Now in this case, I showed them what I was going to be doing with my numbers, and I showed them the quotes I had for the road, and I said, look, right after we close on this, within a week or two, we're going to be spending $85,000 to improve the roads. So do you think you can work with me? You think you can get me an extra 5%? And they said yes. So if we weren't doing that, I don't think they would have done that. So the difference there is a difference of about $36,000 because they were going to lend us an extra 5% versus what the price was. So that was one portion, right? The bank lends us an extra $36,000 because we showed them the full scope of what this project was. It was not merely, hey, I'm trying to put less down. It was, hey, I need you to loan me more because to make our numbers work with how much we're going to be investing after we purchase it, I think it's justified. And we're able to do that when we have a good banking relationship. I would not have been able to do this the first time I bought a park and I was just trying to prove my plan. Now, the second thing that was done here was I got the seller to credit us $30,000 at closing. Now, this was not done as a retrade. This was done before we ever went under contract. I was able to tell the seller, like, look, it's going to be a lot of money to fix the roads. Now, the seller was kind of stuck on her price. She had a very specific number she needed to get because she had gotten offers lower than that. And what I was able to do is while I was under contract, before we were under contract, I worked with her broker and I had him get me some quotes on the roads. And he was shocked. He was like, wow, they were 70, 80. One was even for $100,000. And then that was kind of my way of politely showing them, you're not going to get the price you wanted without kind of working with me a little bit, because there's a lot of work to be done here. Now, the reason I like to get a seller credit versus just a price reduction is because it's a little bit of extra financing you can get, because a lot of these banks are going to give you their loan amount based on the purchase price. So if you lower your purchase price, you're going to therefore lower your loan amount. Whereas if you can keep the same purchase price, but get the seller to take some of their proceeds and give them to you, it actually works out better. Now let's look at the two scenarios where one, we lower the price by $30,000, and the other one, we get the seller to credit us $30,000. In both scenarios, the seller is going to net the same, right? But let's look at the first one. So if we paid $725 and we get an 80% loan to value, that means we're going to get a loan of $580. We're going to have a down payment of $145,000, but the seller is going to credit us $30,000 towards that. So she takes her loan proceeds, and on the closing statement, $30,000 of it just goes right to us. So that means we only need $115,000 at closing to close it. Versus if we went and paid $695 for it, we'd still get an 80% loan to value, and the loan amount would be less. It'd be $556. So we'd have to bring $139,000 to close, and there's no credit. The seller's going to walk away with the same amount, but in scenario B, we need $24,000 less than we do. No, I'm sorry. In scenario A, we need $24,000 less than we do in scenario B. And again, this is something that you want to be very upfront with your bank about. I've worked with this bank a half dozen times on different deals, so they understand what I'm doing and they're fine with it. You could definitely get in trouble if you don't kind of tell your bank this up front and they get to closing and they see, wow, they're putting in so little. Also, if this number gets to be too large a percent of the total deal, you might be in trouble. So let's say you paid $1 million and you want the seller to somehow agree to credit you $200,000. Well, if you go into that deal with no money down, the bank's going to probably have a problem with that. So the biggest thing I could tell you is that you need to be upfront with your bank on what you're doing. And in our case, we did it from the jump. This was not a retrade at the last moment. As soon as we went under contract, we sent the bank the contract. and they understood it. They understood what we were doing, but it allows them to check their box of, hey, they're not exceeding a certain loan to value or a loan to cost when we purchased it. And so it works for them and it works for me as well. Now, this park had been paved before, and because this park has existed for 30 plus years, the design and the layout was pretty much what it was. So we had to work around it. And what I mean by that, you can see in some of these cases, we gave the tenant a 20 by 20 parking pad. And then on others, the home was so far away from the road that we stretched it and basically gave them a parking pad that was half the width, but twice the length. Now, that's probably not how I would design it if I were to just build this park from scratch. But since we know how these tenants park, we wanted to go ahead and just laid it out in a way that made the most sense for what was there. Now, it's not the most symmetrical thing in the world, but at the end of the day, it's functional. And even if the current home were to leave, if another home were to come in there, in almost all of these cases, they're going to want to put a home in the exact location. So that tenant would just end up either having to make a walkway or walk through grass all the way to their house, which kind of just defeats the purpose for us. Now, this asphalt was about 3 inches thick, and you can see in some sections they actually had to do 2 layers to get the first layer to where they patched the holes, and then the other layer was to go over and actually make the road smooth. So you can see in the front part of the park, the road was so bad that they did an entire asphalt from front to back, and then they came back and did another one over that to make it to where it was actually smooth. So start to finish, the entire process of repaving the roads took about a week. So they started on a Monday, and by Friday afternoon, they had completely wrapped up. The first day, they were basically going around and cleaning things up. So where there was going to be parking pads, which was currently grass, they were going and scraping it and adding some gravel or some crush and run down so that the pavement would go over that. And if there were potholes, they were trying to do some initial fill of those. Now, the second day, they were doing more of that, and they started doing some of the driveways. And by day 3, they had finished all the driveways. And Thursday and Friday was basically doing the entire main road section. Now, in terms of the cost, about half of the cost was the main road, and the other half of the cost was the driveways, which is why the driveways were mostly 20 by 20 square feet. Some were longer than that, some were shorter than that, but they average out to about that much. I have to say, for me, being there during this process and filming it with my drone was a ton of fun to see the improvements being made. And it was also cool to see some of the tenants came out and thanked me for finally doing it, because we only owned the property for about 2 weeks at this point, and they were already seeing some improvements, and they were really excited to see. Another thing that we did that I did not expect when we started this process was the road contractor ended up bringing in an entire dump truck load worth of dirt and basically filling in from the edge of the road to where the grass started. Now, this was not something we really expected, but after we scraped the roads to try to prep the main road itself to get the pavement, we realized, hey, this is going to look a lot better if we put some dirt down. And this was done in the middle of winter, so we hadn't planted grass yet, which is why it still looks a little bit dirty and muddy. But when spring comes around, we're going to try to get some grass seed out there and get it to where you just see perfect green grass right up to the road. And I got to say, seeing the finished product of the road in person while I was there was so cool to see, because it just looked a million times better. Now, I know the park is nowhere near where we want it to be in terms of all of the improvements. Most of what we're going to be working on now is taking out some of the dead trees and fixing the landscaping, some of the signage, getting new mailboxes installed, which we've already done at the point of making this video. But a lot of what we have ahead of us is getting the tenants to improve their houses, which is a very difficult thing to do if you have not fixed the property first, because basically what you have is you're trying to get the people to fix their home when you haven't even fixed the property which you're responsible for. So now that we are nearly done getting the infrastructure improved, the next phase of this process was going to be about 5 years of just getting the tenants to improve their homes slowly. So typically what I like to do is make a list of what I want to see each tenant do, right? Some are going to need to paint the houses, fix their skirting, patch it. And then there's probably 1 or 2 here that are just too far beyond repair that we're going to have to ask to leave. And what we'll do in those cases, sometimes we buy the home from them just so they have some cash and they can move out. And then we're going to have a brand new home come in. Now, what's a redeeming quality about this park is there already are some brand new homes in there, which I typically don't see in a park with this high a percentage of what I would call older homes. But the market here is so strong that people were still willing to move in a new home based on the way the park used to look. So I'm very confident that as we continue to make the improvements, that we're going to have absolutely no problem attracting new tenants at a much higher rent than these current tenants are. And so that's basically what we have on our plate for the next 5 years. getting the tenants to improve their homes and just continuing to maintain the property and attract new homes where we can. So in summary, the project went really well. And here is the estimated value that we are adding by doing this, right? So the total project cost us about $85,000 to do, right around $3,000 per lot. And we think by being able to charge an extra $50 a month way down the line, once all the other things at this property are stabilized, we think that will add an extra $150,000 in value to the property. Plus, we think because it will be a higher quality property at that point, we think the roads will justify people being willing to pay a 7% cap rate versus an 8% cap rate, which is a difference in value of about $200,000. So between those two things, we're looking at about $350,000 in potential added value for an investment of $85,000. Not considering the fact that we actually got some financing on that $85,000, we're looking at a multiple of about 4.1. So pretty good. And this is why I love mobile home park investing, because there is absolutely no doubt that property is way better than it was a couple months ago. So we have dramatically improved the quality of that property, the quality of the tenants' lives. So it's a much, much better community now. And as the owner of the property, it's more valuable. So it ends up being a much nicer community. And as the owner of the property, it's a much more valuable community. So it's a win-win for both sides of it. So if you like the video, you like the explanation, you want to see more videos like this, definitely leave a comment below on some topics you'd want to see me cover. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel to see any future videos that come out. Thanks.